In our next chapter, we're going to focus on a set of numbers called the integers. But before we dive into that, we want to introduce the idea of algebra. We're going to start very, very gently and kind of slowly expose you to some of these very basic ideas of algebra. That way, when we get to our chapter on algebra, it won't be quite so overwhelming. So for this first video, we're going to understand and look at something called algebraic expressions. So we got a whole bunch of definitions. So let's get started. So first, algebra, just in general, you might be like, what in the world is algebra? Well, it's a branch of mathematics, and it's specifically the branch of mathematics that uses variables in place of numbers. So when you start seeing X's and Y's in your math, you're doing some type of algebra, okay? Now, we've got to sort of build this idea of what is an algebraic expression. So the first thing we need to understand is what is a variable. Okay, I already mentioned the word, but let's really talk about what that is. A variable is a letter or symbol. For us, it's generally going to be a letter. You could certainly use symbols, but at this point, we'll usually use like X's and Y's, P's, S's, T's, stuff like that. So we're dealing with a variable, it's a letter or symbol that takes the place of a number. Common variables are X, Y, Z, and N. You are not limited to X, Y, Z, and N. Those are just some variables that you'll very commonly see at this level. Now, in order to understand a variable, you need to understand kind of its sort of like, I guess, counterpart. We have something called a constant. A constant is a number that stands alone. It's not multiplied by a variable, okay? So, for example, if I had something like X plus 5. X is the variable, and 5 all by itself, it's just added or subtracted to some variable term, or it can be standing there with nothing else. Just what you need to understand is it's not multiplied by a variable. This is called a constant. So make sure you understand the difference between a constant and a variable, and then the next couple of definitions we're going to look at too. So next up, we have a term. Terms I think of as kind of the building blocks of an algebraic expression. So a term, it can be a variable by itself, it can be a constant by itself, or it can be the product of a variable and a constant. Okay, so if we go back to this example, X plus 5, X is a term, 5 is a term, but what if we had something like, let me erase this one. What if we had something like 4x minus 7y plus 2? Well, in this case, we have three terms. We have a term 4x, we have a term negative 7y, and we have a term plus 2, okay? So we have these three terms, and hopefully what you've noticed, especially with this example, we separate terms with addition and subtraction. So that's really important. That can kind of help you see the different components of an algebraic expression. Look for those plus and minus signs, and that's going to separate those terms for you, okay? So next up, we have a coefficient. So a numerical coefficient is sometimes what it's called. We'll just call it a coefficient, but it's very common to see it called a numerical coefficient. But a coefficient is the numerical factor of a variable term. So you have to kind of ask yourself, what's a factor? So go back into the previous chapter. We learned that factors are numbers that are being multiplied together. So in this case, it's just two things that are going to be multiplied together. So if you have a term that contains a variable, the number that that variable has been multiplied by becomes your coefficient. So some really simple examples, you could have stuff like negative 3x. The coefficient here would be negative 3 because negative 3 and x are your factors, and we're looking for the number factor. We could have something like 5z. Well, the coefficient here would be 5 because the variable z has been multiplied by 5. What if we had something like y? Well, in this case, you might be like, well, we haven't multiplied the y by anything, but we secretly have. Technically, we have 1y. We would never show the multiplication of 1. We would just assume that 1 is there. So 1y is just 1y. But we need to remember that, hey, secretly behind the scenes, there is a coefficient here, and it happens to be 1. You won't see the 1 written out. You just need to know it's there. Similarly, what if we had something like negative x? Well, if we have something like negative x, that's technically negative 1x. Again, we're not going to write the actual 1 because negative 1x is just negative x. They're the same thing. But we do need to know that there is a coefficient here, and it is negative 1. Okay? So when you're dealing with a term that has a factor or a variable term that has a factor that's a number, that becomes your numerical coefficient. So all terms have some kind of a coefficient. And then finally, the big definition that we're looking for is a combination of operations on variables and numbers is called an algebraic expression. So you could see it called an algebraic expression or just flat out an expression. It means the same thing. So basically, when you have a sum or difference of terms, that's another way to think of this, you have an expression. So this is a sum or difference of terms. So when you have a series of terms that you've added and subtracted, you have an algebraic expression. Notice at this point, we don't have an equal sign or anything. We just have addition and subtraction of these terms, okay? So those are your algebraic expressions. Don't get too bent out of shape about like memorizing these definitions. The goal is to kind of understand what's going on and to understand these different pieces of an algebraic expression. So let's look at example 1. So for example 1, it says label each expression. So we're going to take all of the different parts of each expression and we're going to kind of figure out what each of those parts are. So we're going to think about the different definitions we've looked at. So variables, constants, terms, coefficients, things like that. Okay. So looking at part A, we have 4x squared plus 9x plus 2. Notice we have two plus signs separating three different terms. So we do have three terms here, so keep that in mind, okay? Now, when we're looking at this expression, we have one variable that shows up, okay? It shows up in two different terms, but it's the same type of variable. So in this case, we would say that we have a variable of just x. So that's the variable that is present here. You could certainly have an algebraic expression that had more than one type of variable, okay? Now, when it comes to the terms, remember, terms are separated by addition and subtraction. So our first term is 4x squared. Our second term is 9x, and our third term is 2. One thing I do want you to notice here, we don't have a negative term, but terms are either positive or negative. So if you have a minus sign or a negative sign in front of a term, it makes that term negative, okay? Now, as far as the coefficients are concerned, let's look at the coefficient for each of these terms. So the coefficient for 4x squared, well, we have 4 times this x squared piece. So remember, a coefficient is the number factor of a variable term. So we have a coefficient of 4. We have 9 times x, so we have a product of a constant and a variable, which makes a term. So the coefficient here is 9. And then when you're dealing with a constant, you can say that the coefficient is the constant. It's sort of a tricky thing that's a much higher level of algebra. So you can either say there's no coefficient or you can say 2. It's not going to flip me out. In this case, since we're looking at constants separately, I'm going to stop here and look at the constant for this last part. Okay? So when it comes to a constant is a number that stands alone. That means that constant has not been multiplied by any kind of variable. So we would say here the constant is just 2. Okay. Now, for part 5, this one's a little tricky because notice we have a set of parentheses. So you have to kind of go way back to the previous chapter. In the previous chapter, we talked about something called the distributive property. And I told you at that time, it's not super powerful at that point, but when you start getting into algebra, it is really powerful. It's like a really cool thing that we can do. So the distributive property basically allows you to multiply through addition or subtraction. So you can multiply through a set of parentheses. So if I had something like A and then in parentheses, so A times parentheses B plus C, what I can do is I can take the A and multiply it by both parts of that sum. So this would equal A times B plus A times C. Well, we can do the exact same thing with algebra, which is really cool. So we can take this 5 and multiply it by the x. That just gives me 5 times x. You don't have to do anything besides write them side by side. And then I have 5 times 2, which is 10. So this one's a little bit tricky. We had to do some work, but the expression that we really have is 5x plus 10. So what is our variable here? Well, our variable is x again. We have two different terms here. They're separated by addition. So we have the term 5x and the term just 10. Remember, a term can be a variable, it can be a constant, or it can be the product of a variable and a constant. As far as coefficients go, this 5x, it's a variable term. And for now, we're just going to kind of focus on variable terms. The coefficient of 5x is 5. And then as far as constants are concerned, a constant would be a number that is not multiplied by a variable. We do have a constant of 10. Okay, so again, don't get too hung up on like memorizing these definitions or regurgitating them, but do take some time to really study and understand the different parts of an algebraic expression.